Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor, and I just wanna quilt. Today we have Brian Frye. He's part of our quilting army. He is an artist. He is a law professor. He makes movies. He makes art movies, and he makes documentaries about like people like Nixon. He's like so cool. He gets us to really cool people. He keeps suggesting like the coolest people to talk to. And he's a good sport because I really mess up the audio on the first time we talked. So we did a second take on it. So this is my conversation with Brian Frye. He's a law professor at University of Kentucky. And the reason I wanted to chat with him is we chatted about, he had to give a presentation for Weavers this summer. That got us starting to talk about these issues, and he's got a lot of thoughts and gives us a really interesting perspective on thinking through what it is to be an artist, to be a quilter, and the role of copyright law in all of that.
All right, yeah, leveraging the students. Huh?
Totally. Well, it's good for them, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're going to just do it again, and we're going to try to go for maybe half hour.
Sure.
Talk about sort of your life, not your quilting life, of course, but your life, and like what we talked about before. So I think the thing that I really liked about our conversation was talking about, I really love the talk about art and thinking about like objects that are unique objects and how they fit into the copyright and all the other stuff we talked about. So we can just kind of ramble in any way we want. Does that sound like a good plan?
Sure.
All right. So we're going to start with, let's test your level. Just make sure this time it works. Can you say hi?
Sure. Brian Frye. Hi. How you doing, Elizabeth?
Oh, that's great. It looks great. We have different recording stuff now too, so that helps too. Oh, there you are. Hey,
Great.
There you are. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, I think Zoom is a more stable platform.
That's what we're on. Yeah, Zoom is much better. And then I turn off my video because it doesn't seem to like my video. And then the other thing,
probably, I'm gonna turn off my video too and see.
Yeah, it was good. And then we also recorded on a secondary thing called Audio Hijack, which is turned out to be amazing. So it allows us to do, a couple of ways that we're doing it. So
great,
okay, cool.
Great. Yeah, no, I do a bunch of long distance nonprofit boards, and I find that Zoom has become the most popular sort of meeting software at this point.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Something they're doing is just making it better. Like the mixing is good, and the sound quality is really good. It doesn't drop as much as other ones.
Yeah. And it's nice for larger boards too, because it seems to handle multiple people joining better than some of the other systems do. So
yeah, it does. And I teach class in it. And so it's good that way too. So it's really interesting. So okay, cool. Well, why don't we start where we always start with just tell me your name and where you are, and then we'll do the first question.
Okay, great. So Brian L. Frye, I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Kentucky College of Law, where I've been teaching law for 6 years now, mostly intellectual property and nonprofit organizations.
Really cool. And tell us your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life. Do you have one?
Sure. Actually, my grandmother was a very prolific knitter and sewer. Not so much quilting, but she made clothing. She knitted a lot of sweaters and other things for us when we were children. And she also handmade all of our Halloween costumes. So I remember specifically that she made Batman and Robin costumes for me and my brother when we were young, that we would wear around all the time, not just during Halloween.
Very good. That's super important. Yes. Well, we live in New Orleans, so like costumes are year round here. So.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's true. We don't even notice when people are in costumes here.
Yeah, no, I remember my grandmother. She always had the sewing machine set up in the dining room, and she showed my brother and I both how to thread it and put the bobbins in, and how to use it. When we were kids.
Well, before you were a law professor, you had your own kind of artistic world and your artistic life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Yeah. So I graduated from college at UC Berkeley pretty young, and immediately went to art school and did a Master of Fine Arts at the San Francisco Art Institute. After which I moved to New York City and spent about 5 years working and engaging in the film and art community in New York. We're working at the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, Anthology Film Archives, the Filmmakers Co-op, so on and so forth. Making films, writing about films, and showing films as well. So a friend of mine and I ran a weekly film series called the Robert Beck Memorial Cinema on the Lower East Side for about 4.5 or 5 years. We did about, like 250 programs or so. Wow. Over that course of time. And, it was, I think, a moderately significant contribution to the experimental film culture of New York City at that point in time. So in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, I think it ended up kind of being inspired by some similar kinds of film series in other cities, including San Francisco and Chicago. And also sort of, I think, hopefully inspiring some subsequent film series, which I'm also involved with in New York and in other places. So I did all that before going to law school. So I kind of went to law school with an ingrained perspective from the art world already.
Why did you go to law school?
Well, I was looking for something new and different to do. And, it struck me that, everyone I knew in the art world was constantly running into legal, or what seemed anyway, like legal problems, but no one knew any lawyers and no one knew who to ask for help. And so it just seemed like sort of an interesting possibility. I also worked for someone, Don Krim at Kino International, who actually had gone to Columbia Law School and then decided not to be a lawyer, but instead to run a film distribution company. So that was really, kind of intriguing to me as well, to see somebody kind of straddling both worlds in that way. And then I met a painter, a woman in Houston, who was kind of a lawyer artist as well. And I think she kind of made it seem like a possibility for me in a way that other people hadn't. So I kind of saw how that could work for someone. And it got me interested and kind of set me on that new path.
That's very cool. Well, the reason why I wanted to chat with you is because you have this really cool background, and I wanted to chat with you more about your thoughts about copyright. Now, what's interesting is that there is an intersection, because we do have art quilts, and quilts are an artistic form. And so what I thought we would chat about is sort of, what are your thoughts? Like, do you think copyright is like the same across the board, or do you think like is a art film different than a commercial film? Like, should we, when you hear the word copyright, and if people are listening, how are we supposed to understand this world? I know it's a really stupid big question, but sort of how do you approach copyright when you start to talk to people, when you talk to the artists that you went to school to help them sort of be a discourse translator? How do you explain copyright to them, and how are we supposed to understand it as quilters?
Right. I think copyright is an awkward fit for a lot of what people do in the art world, albeit not necessarily all of what people do in the art world. So, in some cases, it provides a useful or potentially useful metaphor or lens for looking at artistic production and the kinds of goals that artists have. In other cases, it doesn't. Of course, copyright was created in order to sort of manage the production and ownership of exclusive rights in reproducible commercial works. And I think the problem with a lot of the kind of production that people do in the art world is that what they're doing is neither reproducible nor, strictly speaking, commercial, right? So, the traditional kind of concept of the art world is really structured around scarcity and high cultural or cultural consumption. And so, you neither have the sort of structural market qualities that are sort of what copyright was designed to manage, nor do you have the sort of social context in which, the more kind of mass market commercial social context that copyright was sort of intended to facilitate. And so for that reason, I think, especially for people working in non-reproducible media, copyright often doesn't work very well to help them conceptualize ownership in ways that are relevant and useful to individual artists or communities of artists. Among other things, I think, one thing that's really conceptually and practically complicated about using copyright in a scarcity art market context is that, of course, copyright is designed to protect intangible works of authorship and actually doesn't conceptualize unique objects at all. A unique painting is theoretically, from a copyright perspective, just a copy of the intangible work of authorship that it embodies. But from an artist's perspective, I think people think very tangibly. They're thinking about the objects themselves, and copyright is really not designed to work with that, and attempts to kind of shoehorn the kinds of things that artists want to accomplish into the Copyright Act, like things like Vera, end up being a really awkward fit that often doesn't work in the way that people intended, and often ends up producing very peculiar outcomes when actually applied.
All right, so totally. So let's go down scenarios. So if people didn't really understand, some people totally understand what you just said, and I thought it was super cool. But let's go through it like a hypothetical. So I'm an artist.
Sure. Well, so
yeah. So tell me.
Yep.
So I'm an artist and I want to make something. And when do I start to worry about copyright in what I decide to make? Whether that's a sculpture or a quilt or a film, take us through sort of like the creative and you're a filmmaker. So when you start a film, do you start to worry, are you infringing on other people's stuff? Or where do you start when does copyright come into your creative process? I guess is the question.
Right. So I think from my perspective, and my sense is from the perspective of most artists working in a fine art context, actually copyright really isn't and kind of shouldn't be conceptualized as relevant to much of their working process at all.
So, okay, let me ask you a question. So if that's true, does that mean that when you're creating an art quilt, you don't care at all what materials you use or where you borrow from or what you're doing? It doesn't make any difference to you when you're doing that creative part of the project?
No.
Good. Well, that's right. That's the way it should be, right? So, right. So let's say I borrow from, I borrow from Jeff Koons and every famous person that will probably sue me, right? That's actually a project I would love to do. I think that would be really interesting. But you borrow a whole bunch of stuff from a whole bunch of things and you make this really cool art film and a really cool thing and your commentary and everything, and now it's done. You didn't worry about copyright at all. Now what happens?
Right. So okay, I think the best way I could illustrate this would be to talk about two different kinds of work that I've engaged in
Fabulous.
personally, right? So most of the time when I make films and or